going to say hi to the other sites. We're being joined this morning, and if this is new for you, I know it is a bit weird, but we're joined on screen by the good people of Ellen and Stonehaven and also St Macra Academy. So let's give them a great big cheer. Hello, guys. And if you're visiting there, then yeah, this is as weird as you think it is, but this is just how we connect together as a family, and we actually really love it. So before we get into the scriptures this morning, just to kind of report back, Taryn and I and a whole bunch of people from our church have been this week at Soul Survivor in Scotland. You guys can cheer at least. Yeah, come on. And there'll be people at the other sites as well who've been there. And it was just such a sweet time. Lots of people say, the church in the Western world is in decline, and that may well be technically true, but there is such a lot of hope for the church, particularly in Scotland, if you to go and visit those guys worshipping away, hundreds and hundreds of young people from all across Scotland. And please do ask the guys who've been, what their perceptions were. I just wanted to give a couple of things that really struck me. The first thing was that it actually took place at Lendrick Muir, which is in Kinross. And actually, we had our church weekend there years ago. And we all fitted in this room, I was like, how did we all fit in here? It's amazing. But what was amazing about it was that obviously that place belongs to Scripture Union. And that particular week is normally their most lucrative week. It's normally their busiest week for Scripture Union holidays. And yet they said, no, we're going to give that week to Soul Survivor. And I was speaking to one of the guys who's kind of in leadership in Scripture Union, and he was saying, no, we just wanted to communicate to all of our volunteers and all of our staff team and everyone who's connected with Scripture Union around Scotland that the kingdom matters and that we don't want to let anything get in the way. There's nothing that's sacred. There's nothing that should get in the way of the gospel being communicated to as many young people across Scotland as possible. And I just love the heart of that. And honestly, I think that those guys have raised the bar in terms of unity amongst the churches. If we're going to see Scotland transformed and the church set ablaze again for Jesus, then actually what it'll take is the whole church, and the whole gospel and all of the Holy Spirit. And I just feel so thrilled about that. It was just such a powerful testimony to the church and the world. And then the other thing was just reminded again that in his presence there's power. And there's power to break chains and to bring healing and to restore hope and all of that stuff. And obviously, there's more time at a conference to wait on God and just soak in his presence. But honestly, what he was doing was amazing. It was just amazing. And there are loads and loads of stories about physical healing. There was a lady who had been in a wheelchair for 5 years and told that she would never walk again. And then she was running around the room, and there's all kinds of amazing things. But for us as a church, you may not even remember this, but we said right at the start of the year that for this year in particular, we're saying our priority is to really pursue the presence and power of God. And I'm just more convinced than ever that prayer ministry and just soaking in God's presence is the way forward for us. And so just as a little way of communicating that, what we're going to try and do, now you all know that this won't actually happen in the way that we intend, but what we're going to try and do is just to try and get the notices over and done with as quickly as possible and all the other stuff as quickly as possible, try and speak for as short as possible, and that's why it probably won't happen in the way that we intend, just so that we can give as much time at the end of our service as possible just to wait on God. And rather than just have that sense of it all being a bit like a Band-Aid, or we'll say a quick prayer for you and then we'll all go for lunch, just being much more like, do you know what, let's see whether God would want to come and perform heart surgery rather than just put a Band-Aid on. And so I've said enough, but it's just such a great time. If you can ever visit Soul Survivor, even just for a day, then I'd really encourage you to do that. I know it was easier when it was in Inverurie than it is when it's in Kinross, but just so brilliant. Okay, so we're in a series right now in the story of Joseph, and in particular, we're looking at relationships. We've called the series A Relationships Revolution, and we're really wanting God to strengthen our relationships and through the scriptures to understand how do we relate better to one another and how do we do this relationship thing better. And what you might remember from last time is that we got to the point where Potiphar's wife has come on over strong. She's obviously kind of full of hormones and she's a bit oversexed. And so she's kind of come on really strong to Joseph. And he's resisted the temptation to engage with that. And he's run out of the room and he's left his coat behind. So Genesis 39 is where we're going to read. And we're going to start at verse 13. When she, that's Potiphar's wife, saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." That's not quite true, is it? Anyway, she kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. When I was at school, we had a supply teacher called Mr. Johnson, and he was an Irish guy. He always wore a double-breasted jacket, I remember. I don't know why that's important, but he was absolutely rubbish at controlling the class. I mean, terrible. And so whenever the teacher was away and he was there, you were like, brilliant. This is just a whole lesson of doing absolutely nothing. And bless him, he used to, kind of walk around the room and try and encourage people to get on with their work and just try and just help them, keep them on task. But really, it wasn't really happening. And my friend Ben Leatham noticed that every time he came to our desk, he put his hands on the desk in the same place. And so when he was over the other side of the room, I have told this story before, my friend Ben Leatham, he got an ink cartridge and he emptied it onto the place where Mr. Johnson usually put his hands when he was at our desk. And so Mr. Johnson came round and he put his hands on the desk and he didn't notice that he'd put his hands in the ink. And then later on in the lesson, he just started he had a little bit of an itch on his forehead, and then he had obviously an itch on his side of his face. And at that point, somebody in the class said, "Sir, you've got something on your face." And so, of course, he was like, where is it? And started covering his whole face. And then we were like, no, honestly, sir, it's black ink. And he looked at his hand, and he was a bit worried, and so then he took out a handkerchief and he started trying to wipe it, and it was just making it worse. And then because it was a biology lab, he then turned on the tap and he soaked his hanky in water, and then he started smearing it, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And to be honest, that was the last lesson that Mr. Johnson ever taught us. We never saw him again. But just as he was leaving the classroom to go and sort himself out, he pointed at me and he said, "You boy, stand up." And I was like, "Oh no." And he said, "I hold you personally responsible. Go and see the headmaster." And I was like, "But that's so unfair. That wasn't me. It wasn't me, sir. I didn't do that. It was Ben Leatham." And he said, "I hold you personally responsible." And I said, "But it's not fair." And he said what all adults say when they hear a kid say it's not fair. They say, "Life isn't fair." It's true, isn't it? Life isn't fair. The truth is, of course, that lots of things that we feel are real injustices when we're younger actually turn out to be that not big of a, not much of a deal. Kids all the time say things like, "But Gary down the road, he gets to stay up till 2 a.m. every night, and I have to go to bed at 7:30. Or Barry down the road, his mum lets him have Nike Air trainers, and I've got Georgia Asda trainers. Or, why is it that my sister gets more pocket money than me?" And all of that kind of stuff. It's not fair. And to be honest, it turns out that isn't actually that much of a deal. But as we walk through life, we discover that actually injustice is one of the biggest causes of pain in our lives. And many of the people here or in the other sites will know exactly what I mean. You know, for some of us, it's like it wasn't fair when your dad walked out on you when you were a kid. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that your wife cheated on you. It wasn't fair that in the swimming pool that man took advantage of you. It wasn't fair that when there were job cuts in the air, all your colleagues turned on you. It wasn't fair that people started to spread malicious or totally false allegations about you, or that you were relentlessly bullied at school. It wasn't fair. And that is the truth, isn't it? That life isn't fair, and it causes us very significant pain, especially when it involves some of our closest and dearest relationships. And the question we're going to look at today is, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with injustice? How do we deal with people when they're not being fair to us? What is the godly way to respond when we're the victims of injustice? And of course, the story of Joseph is brilliant for that because, you know, as we just read, he, having been the favorite son and knowing the love and affirmation of his dad, he's rejected by the rest of his family, and he's packed on a camel off to Egypt. And there in Egypt, he starts to find a home, starts to make a life again. And it seems to me that Potiphar was almost like a kind of a new father figure for him. And he's just starting to get to grips with things. He's being recognized for his gifts, and he's being affirmed in those things. And then just at that moment, this woman, who's obviously, you know, a bit out of control, she makes these totally false allegations, and before long, it's all gone. It's like experiencing the pain of the rejection of his first family all over again. And so what we're going to look at today is, what can we learn from Joseph about how we respond when life doesn't treat us in the way that we deserve? And the first thing is this: don't be surprised when you experience injustice. Actually, injustice is just a normal part of living in a broken world. You know, God didn't create the cosmos like that. He created it to be totally just and totally fair and with total purity. But the world is now infested, isn't it, with selfishness and sin and jealousy and hatred. And so we don't live in a perfect world any longer. But the other thing is, of course, that for us as Christians in particular, as God's people, injustice is now a way of life. It's normal for the people of God. So often we live with the mistaken notion that the more mature you are in the faith and the deeper your Christian commitment and the closer you draw near to God, that life will be easier, that your life will look a little bit more like that of a winner. You know, and actually lots of Christian TV and the stuff that you'd find on the internet would seem to suggest that. I just literally watched about 2 minutes of that new Freeview channel the other night. What was it called? TBN or something like that. It's a Christian TV channel, and there was a guy there who was basically saying that the closer you draw near to God, the easier your life will be. If only that were the case, if only. The problem with that picture is that there is no place in that kind of theology for suffering. And yet, the way of the Christian is the way of Christ, which is the way of the cross. I've been so struck this week, just as I've been reflecting on just this whole series of injustices that pile up on Jesus on the way to the cross. He's betrayed in the most brutal way possible with a kiss by one of his disciples. And then he's brought into a place where people just make up lie after lie after lie about him. And some of you know what that's like, to just have someone lie and lie and lie about you. And then he's brought before Pontius Pilate, and actually after interrogation, Pontius Pilate says in John chapter 18 verse 38, he says this: I find no basis for a charge against him. I find no basis for a charge against him. And yet 2 verses later, in chapter 19 verse 1, it says this: Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. It's not fair, is it? And actually twice more in chapter 19, Pilate says, I find no basis for a charge against him, and yet he gives him over to be crucified. It's not fair. It's not right. He doesn't deserve it. And then Jesus says to us, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It's a road marked with suffering. There's pain in the offering. But it's the way of the cross and it's the way of Christ. And so therefore it's the way of the Christian. And so in 1 Peter, the Apostle Peter says this, 1 Peter 4 verse 12, dear friends, do not be surprised. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though some strange thing were happening to you. It's actually one of the main themes of Peter's writing, this whole concept of suffering and not being taken by surprise, not suddenly thinking, hang on a minute, what's going on? It's like this is to be expected because we follow Jesus. And obviously he's observed the suffering of Jesus and the injustice that was heaped upon Jesus firsthand and at close quarters. And so therefore he knows it's going to happen to us too. Don't be surprised when life turns out not to be fair. Don't be surprised. That's the first thing. Don't be surprised. It's just normal. It's just normal. It's normal for living in this world, and it's especially normal for the followers of Christ. But secondly, the second thing we learn from the story of Joseph is this. Don't throw in the towel. Don't throw in the towel. I could totally imagine what must have been going through Joseph's head. So this is what happens when you do the right thing, is it? You know, I tried to do the right thing and be kind to my dad, and I was thrown in a pit. I tried to be nice to my brothers and I was strapped to a camel and sent off to Egypt. I tried to do the right thing by my boss. And this woman came along and she tempted me. And if my boss had been in the room, he would have seen that I'd done the right thing. And here I am in prison. It's like this is what happens when you do the right thing. And often we become skeptical and jaded. And we just think, well, if that's what happens when you do the right thing, I'm just going to not bother. I'll just give them a taste of their own medicine. I'll just take revenge. I'll just do whatever it takes. But I can't do the right thing anymore. It's exhausting. Maybe some people here, you've arrived at that point where you just think, I'm done with doing the right thing. I'm tired of pursuing purity in my marriage. I'm tired of working with integrity or doing my tax returns honestly. It's too costly. And yet there isn't the faintest glimmer in the text that Joseph does anything other than walk with integrity and to walk with God. How does he do that? Where does he get the strength from to just carry on, putting one foot in front of the other and doing the right thing? Well, I think the clue comes in the second half of verse 20, where it says this, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. His proximity to the presence of God is what gave him the strength and the courage to keep going. And actually it goes on, it says, the Lord was with him and the Lord showed him kindness. And actually that's not a very good translation. In the ESV, the English Standard Version, is a better translation. It says this, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. It's great, isn't it? Or the New Living Translation, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. It's the kind of love that never lets go. The truth that we need to get hold of is this. I can maintain my integrity and I can keep doing the right thing because Jesus will never leave me or forsake me. God is with Joseph in the palace and now he's with Joseph in the prison, and nothing's changed. When I first became a Christian, I found the first 6 months incredibly difficult. My friends just thought I'd made a ridiculous decision, and so they relentlessly bullied me and mocked me for the decision that I'd made to follow Jesus. And it became really clear quite early on that I just wasn't really at home there anymore. And yet also I didn't feel completely at home amongst the Christians either, because we used to go, hang out in a youth group and they used to ask for prayer for things that really weren't that big of a deal, I'm finding that getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning to read my Bible every day is just really exhausting. So please could you pray with me about that? Or, I'm just struggling to pray for more than about an hour and a half a day. Or, I was just like, oh, you poor thing. Oh, I just feel so, you must feel so crushed in your spirit because of the really difficult things you're struggling with. And I was struggling with proper things, like proper things. And so it became clear that I wasn't at home with my non-Christian friends, and I wasn't really at home amongst the Christians either. And I went to my youth leader, and I said, I'm just finding this too hard. And to be honest, I think it is just too hard. And so I think I'm just going to give up. And he said this, and I'll never forget it. He said, Jesus never said it would be easy, but he said it would be worth it. One day, we'll see Jesus face to face. And he'll wipe every tear from our eyes. And he'll whisper to us, or maybe shout to us, I don't know, well done, good and faithful servant. God is with us in our struggles. And his presence is what gives us the power to not throw in the towel. If you're in a place right now where life just seems terribly unfair, please don't throw in the towel. The third thing is, don't recycle their weapons. Each time we're treated unfairly, it feels like a kind of a knife in the back, doesn't it? And sometimes it feels like, oh, and there's another one. Oh, and there's another one. Oh, and there's another one. It feels like, how many more knives am I going to get in the back? And after a while, it kind of feels like what we actually want to do is just take out one of the knives out of our own back and then just thrust it back at them. That's what a lady, I've been looking at the news recently. There was 2 people who took proper revenge, right? There was a lady, she was a Saudi lady, and she'd been jilted at the altar or something like that. And then so when her, partner or whatever, he found somebody else and he was going to get married to her. On their wedding day, she took his car and then she drove it around town, driving through red lights. And she just kept driving through and then reversing, and it's all on YouTube. You could just see her driving through and reversing, driving through and reversing. When he got back from his honeymoon, he had a bill for £51,000. There was another guy who I think his girlfriend had broken up with him in a way that he didn't perceive as being very fair. And so what he did was he took a chainsaw to every single one of their possessions and he cut every single one in half. And then he put all of his half on eBay. And so you could buy like half a teddy bear, half a CD collection, half an iPhone 6, half a laptop, and even half a Vauxhall Corsa. You can see it all on YouTube. And there's something within us that says, yeah, that's the way you deal with people. When they stick it in you, you stick it back in them. Let's have a little bit of a look at some of the knives that went into Joseph's back. The first one, I think they're all going to come up in a one. The first one is gossip. Verse 13. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. It was like, come on, let me tell you what he's done. And isn't that so painful? When it feels like there's a gathering momentum of people who are on the other side, where it's like an increasing number of people are against us. It's so difficult. Another one, blame shifting. Verse 14. She said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. The truth is, she isn't going to take responsibility for anything. Like, she's not holding her hand up for a single thing. In fact, she's even blaming her husband for allowing this man to come into the house. It's like, I'm not to blame in any way for anything. Another one, lies. She goes on, he came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. Now, that's just a barefaced lie. Like, not a single word of that sentence is true. Then he's also on the receiving end of anger-fueled decisions. When Potiphar hears about what's been happening, it says in verse 19 that he burned with anger. And that's not like, oh, he's just a little bit concerned, or he's a bit confused, or he didn't quite understand what was going on. He was absolutely raging. And then in that moment, while he was absolutely filled with rage, he said, right, off to prison with you. And so often, aren't we? We're the recipients of decisions that have been made when people are just furious. Rejection. He's been rejected by his family, and now he's been rejected by Potiphar's family. And revenge, ultimately, what Potiphar's decision amounts to is, you're going to pay for this. And many of us, as we look at that list, will just see a whole bunch of painful knives that have been stuck in our back over the years. Things that have been done to us, said to us, and it wasn't fair. But Joseph feels all these knives digging in his back, and he doesn't recycle a single one. He doesn't touch a single one. Again, just thinking about Jesus. In that moment where he's arrested, it all kicks off. You know, these soldiers and guards come, and they've got clubs and swords and torches and lanterns, and they arrive on the scene. And it says that one of the disciples picked up a sword and chopped off somebody's ear. And actually, John's gospel tells us which disciple it was. It was Simon Peter. He picks up this sword, and he's like, I'm going to get my own back. And Jesus says this thing, which honestly I believe is a word for us in these kind of situations. He says, put your sword down. Put your sword down. It's like that may be how other people roll, but that's not the family way. That's not what we do in our family. And so actually, in moments of intense injustice, the family way is to do the very opposite. It's to say, not only will I not gossip, but actually I'm going to just go just me, and I'm going to go and speak to that person. And if that doesn't work out, I'm just going to take one other person, and I'm going to go. I'm going to try and sort this out. I will not allow this situation to become the subject of gossip or to allow other people to get drawn into it. I will not shift the blame. In fact, I'll hold my hands up and confess my sin. And I'll try and find any single area, even if most of it seems totally unjust. I'll try and find just the slightest thing that I can say, yeah, I can recognize I've done that. And I'll hold my hands up. I'll be ruthlessly honest. I won't make a single decision in anger. In fact, the family way is I pray and I stop. And I consider, and I only make a decision when I know what God is saying. And I'll choose forgiveness over rejection, and I'll choose love over revenge. I'll put my sword down. I'll put my sword down. Romans 12, verse 19 says this, do not take revenge, my dear friends. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. 1 Peter 2:22 is speaking about Jesus, and it says this, he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Here's the thing. Our model is not the Saudi lady who drove backwards and forwards through the red lights. Our model is not the man who took a chainsaw to everything. Our model is Jesus. And he never picks up a sword. And the last thing is, don't miss the chance to help others. When you're on the receiving end of injustice and suffering and pain, don't miss out on the chance to help others. What I love about Joseph is his sensitivity and his compassion, even in the moment when he's right down in the pit. Did he have a big problem? Definitely. Did he have a reason to hold a grudge? Without a question. Could he have spent all of his life consumed with his own problems? Definitely. And who would have blamed him? But what we'll discover in the next chapter is that once he arrives in prison, he notices that there are two other people there who are suffering too. And in verse 6 it says, he saw that they were dejected. And then in verse 7 it says that he cares enough to ask why they were dejected. And it reveals something about the kindness and the compassion of his own heart, that even in that place, even when nobody would have expected him to do anything else, or to really invest in anyone else, he had compassion. There's an American pastor called Leslie Flynn who wrote a little book about the story of Joseph. And in it, he tells this story about a college professor who was treated very unfairly. I think someone had made a whole series of false accusations against him that had no basis in fact, and his whole reputation was completely destroyed. And he was so low. And he went to go and have coffee with a friend, and they were just speaking about it and kind of living in the pain of that moment and just sharing how unfair it was. And then between the two of them, they tried to think about what could we do, or what could he do to kind of pull himself out of the pit. And what he decided to do was he made a list of all the people in his life who had helped him in some kind of a way or encouraged him along the way. And then out of all of those people that he made a list of, he decided that he would select one of them and he would write a letter of thanks to them. And so just as he was praying about it, into his mind's eye came the picture of a teacher who had been in his primary school, and while she was there, she had been the one to instill in him a love for books and literature and had really helped him in that. And so he wrote her just a little letter just saying, I just want to say thank you so much. That really shaped the course of my life. And then a few days later came a reply. And it came in a very shaky hand, obviously from a lady who was very elderly and had been retired for a long time. And it said this: Dear William, when I read your letter, I was blinded with tears. For I remember you as a little fellow in my class. You have warmed my old heart. I've taught school for 50 years. Yours is the first letter of thanks I've received from a student, and I shall cherish it until I die. And that reply encouraged him to write another letter and another letter and another letter. And apparently over the course of the next few weeks, this guy wrote 500 letters of thanks. And by the time he'd finished writing 500 letters of thanks, he'd found that in that pit, in that dungeon, he'd found light. And he'd found it possible to bless other people even in the kind of the darkness and the depth of that pit. If you're in a pit right now of injustice, if you've been opposed or maligned or slandered or falsely accused or misunderstood or wrongly persecuted, you could do what everyone else would do, which is to get your own back or to fight your way out. But Jesus shows us and Joseph shows us that there's another way. Why don't we stand?